welcome everybody. I'm thrilled to see you all here. This is the event with which the Graduate School of Social Sciences kicks off the new academic year. And normally we would have invited all beginning master's students in the social sciences to join us in a huge lecture hall, but that is not allowed this year. So here we find ourselves in the Theater of Crea. Come in. The Student Cultural Center of the University of Amsterdam. And you, dear people in the room, are the quick and lucky ones who have won a seat to be here in person. Many more people are following us via live stream. A warm welcome also to you, invisible people out there in the live stream. If at any point during the event you would like to comment or raise a question, you can do so in the chat under the live stream. And our assistant Naomi will keep an eye on that chat and bring your input to the panel so that you can also become more of a part of this. My name is Annette Freyberg-Inan, and I'm the director of the Graduate School of Social Sciences. Now let me briefly show you what that is and how you fit into the picture. As you can see on the slide, we have master's programs organized in 4 different departments at the Graduate School of Social Sciences: the departments of sociology, the department of anthropology, and that of geography, planning, and international development studies, and that of political science. And the different departments offer anything from 1 master program to 5 different master programs. You can find your own program there in the picture. We also have the Research Master Social Sciences, which is our interdisciplinary program. It's carried by the departments of anthropology, political science, and sociology together. At the bottom, you see the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. That is the integrated research institute of all the social sciences, and all the staff that you come across in your programs, the teachers, are researchers in the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. So what you see in the picture is diversity, different programs, different disciplines, but you also see that this is an integrated whole with a graduate school as one roof that houses all the graduate programs, and the Amsterdam Institute as another roof that houses all the research that we do collectively as the social sciences. There's a lot of fellow students around. A total of more than 800 master's students are expected to start next week. But that there's a lot of fellow students around doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to make friends. And this year it's harder than normal because of the circumstances, obviously. There is a student-run organization in the graduate school that is there to help you integrate, to make it easier. That student organization is called Mascot, and they have prepared a welcome video for you, which I want to show you now.
Hi everybody, we're Mascot, and first of all, we hope you're all doing fine and well in these strange corona times, and that you're excited to start your master's program. Mascot organizes social and academic activities throughout the year, aiming at building a bridge between international and Dutch students and between different master's programs, which should make your stay at the UvA more engaging and exciting. My name is Wie van der Laar, and I will be starting my master's in political economy. I've studied in Dublin for 4 months, and I've studied in Munich in Germany for 6 weeks. And I experienced some difficulties meeting locals myself, and therefore as a Dutch student, I would like to welcome you guys, Dutch students, international students, with open arms, and Mascot is excited to engage all the students. Also, I'm a huge fan of Mexican food, so hit me up if you're down to eat some tacos, nachos, burritos, while drinking some cocktails or drinking some beers.
And we're not only here to integrate Dutch students with internationals, but internationals, we're also here for you. I'm Julia. I'm a 22-year-old student from Poland. I'll be starting my research master in social sciences this year. And as an international, I know how hard it can be to find your way around the city and around the culture. So Mascot has a great offer for you guys too. We're going to be organizing a bunch of events that will help you integrate, find friends, get to know the culture, and just have the best time of your life here in Amsterdam while you're studying. So I'll see you around, and bye.
Hi guys, my name is Naomi Halfheid and I've just finished my Bachelor Dutch Language and Culture last year, and in the upcoming year I will be doing the Master Conflict Resolution and Governance. Besides spending a lot of my time on studying, I am a big Ajax fan, so if you're into football or sports in general, let me know and then we can watch a game with some typical Dutch beer and Dutch bitterballen. As you've heard, Mascot is all about making connections between Dutch and international students. And this brings me to our first event. At the end of next week, we will host an online speed dating event, which can be attended by all of you, whether you're in the Netherlands or not. Our goal is to make sure you can meet some new people in a short time, see if there's a spark, you can exchange your contact details and then maybe hang out in real life later or stay in contact online. More information about the event you can find on our Facebook page or Instagram account. We would love to see all of you joining next week, so make sure you sign up in time and then we'll see you next week. Bye.
Hi guys, congratulations on your enrollment at the UVA. It's very nice to meet you all. I am Amelia and I'm starting my Masters in Political Science International Relations. I am coming to study in Amsterdam, although I hate riding a bike. That is a fun fact. But on the other hand, I do love multiculturalism and I am a very open-minded international person who has been born and raised in Hungary but comes from the UK to the Netherlands, so I am pretty sure I'm not alone with that. And all of you would love to either to integrate with Dutch people or to build cross-national relations with international students for the future with anyone from around the world. We will be here with you all through these next 12 months, which is although very short compared to your previous degree, but we will make sure you get the most out of it as if it wasn't only 1 year. So keep our contact details in mind. Reach us whenever you feel like you need help with anything, literally anything, whether it's study related or it is about your social life or private life or whatever you feel like. Reach us via email at mascotgss@uva.nl or via the GSSS Mascot Facebook page or Instagram account, and make sure you follow these accounts to be up to date on useful information and events we share to make you connectivity happen. You can also visit our website at gss@mascot.com, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks very much to Mascot for making such a fantastic video for us. How many of you are in Amsterdam for the first time? Wow, that's quite a few. Wow, these must be the amazing first days of first impressions of the city. In the Netherlands for the first time? Some more? Yeah. Wow. Welcome, a special welcome to you guys, also to the ones on live stream. I've been a foreign student myself in the United States, and then later a foreign lecturer in several different countries. And I remember feeling privileged that I could study abroad, but now I can tell you that we're also privileged to have you. Studying with us is partly like what you see here on the left in the traditional way, but in even greater part, more like what you see here on the right. And that is why we're really privileged, and we need to have the diversity of students from all backgrounds and all different places in our programs. We really need all your different colors. So welcome. This year is obviously a really strange year. As you may have heard, there's a virus out there, and this virus produced a Friday last March when we here at the university were told that with immediate effect, no one was supposed to come to campus anymore. Not staff, not students. So we moved online practically overnight in a time where, well, there wasn't a break. Classes were going on, and they had to move overnight from Friday to the next Monday. And at the time, I never would have thought that this could be possible, but it worked surprisingly well. All students could continue to study, and they could all complete their studies. One of them is sitting here and can tell you more about how that worked. So it worked quite surprisingly well, but that doesn't mean we like it. We are now allowed to take up some activity on campus, but what we are allowed to organize in the form of teaching on campus is very limited, and this is how it is. It's quite awful. I personally find it awful, and you may as well. But be assured that we take all the room that we get to work with you on campus within the necessary safety precaution rules, of course, and that we will return to normality just as quickly as circumstances allow. But to make that possible, we obviously have to follow some basic rules, and I have to show you the rules, to show you the rules. If you are here in the room, well, you're already familiar with all of that, but some of the people maybe watching this may not be in the country yet and may be less aware of what the rules are. So most importantly, we keep the 1.5 meter distance from each other. Actually, it should be this slide. We keep the distance from each other, and when coming on campus, we follow the instructions, and that means going the way the arrows point. Going in where it says entrance, exiting where it says exit, and doing what the many staff members that are all over campus and in the buildings that are helping to make all this run smoothly, following their instructions and doing what they tell you. This to ensure that, not too many people end up in the same place, which is obviously not allowed. Perhaps the most important rule is to self-quarantine when you're not feeling well. And this can be hard. Maybe you're a little bit like me. I'm used to going to work also when I have a bit of a cold. I think, why should I stay home? But in these days, you really have to. If you have anything that could even remotely be COVID, get a test and don't come to campus. So these some basic rules to familiarize you with if you are not already. But more interestingly, part of normality, to which we want to get back to at the university, are interesting panel discussions. So let's shift from the words of welcome now to the substance of this event. The COVID-19 pandemic, why does it matter? What does it change? And what can we learn from it, or should we learn from it? The point of today is twofold. One is to learn something about the dynamics and the impacts of the COVID pandemic from some of the smartest people here who have studied it. And the second point is to get an illustration of how the different social sciences work, what distinguishes them, but also how they work together, how they complement each other. Much of the research you'll hear about today is actually interdisciplinary, and I will ask the speakers to reflect on how this is so and why this is so. My hope is that you'll learn something today, both about why you are studying in a school that brings the various social sciences together, why we share a roof, and also about what makes your own field special. I want to introduce the speakers to you. Joyeeta Gupta, here on my left, represents the Department of Geography, Planning, and International Development Studies. Anybody here from IDS? Yeah, 1, 2. Well, welcome. Joyeeta Gupta is Professor of Environment and Development and leader of the Research Program Group on Governance and Inclusive Development at the Amsterdam Institute. She's also just completed co-chairing the 6th edition of the UN Environment Programme's Global Environment Outlook. This is a really important report on the state of the environment globally. It's important for informing policy making. And Joyeeta Gupta will talk about how we can use this crisis to make a shift towards more inclusive development and environmental sustainability. So in a way, how we can turn the crisis into a really important opportunity. And in the process, she'll give some more general information about the context and impacts of the COVID pandemic. So it makes sense for her to kick us off in a moment and go first. After will be Danny de Vries. Here, he is associate professor in the anthropology of health and a senior researcher at the Amsterdam Institute for Global Health and Development. Anybody here from anthropology, either cultural or medical? 1, 2, 3, yay! Yay, good fraction, well represented. Danny de Vries is also co-leader of an important research project called Corona Times in the Netherlands, the impact of social distancing on vulnerable populations. It's a study that's financed by the Dutch Organization for Health and Development, and that he leads together with Professor Jeannette Pols, who is also at the anthropology department here. And because this study has basically just been completed and written its final report, he can report on what they found out. Thirdly, Tom van der Meer, I'm standing right in front of him, is professor of political science, and in particular on the topics of legitimacy, inequality, and citizenship. Any political scientists here? Wow. It's all on you. Tom van der Meer is also co-editor of a recent handbook on political trust. He knows everything about that topic. And he's director of the Dutch Parliamentary Election Study. He will examine the question whether the COVID crisis has produced what is called a rally around the flag effect. Does anybody know what that is? I'm not going to put you on the spot by asking you, the lone political scientist in the room. You'll find out what it is, and Tom van der Meer will also tell you what that rally around the flag effect of COVID looks like and what its consequences are. Last not least, we have Lazarus Kontozopoulos, goes by the name of Laz, I practiced. He just graduated from the Master of Medical Anthropology and Sociology, and he also has a degree in clinical psychology from Leiden University. He did his bachelor in Greece, and during that time, he researched migrant labor and worked with drug addicts at a psychiatric hospital. He's done really interesting things. In recent years, he's also been working on mental health issues in the LGBTQI+ community. And he co-authors a medical anthropology blog that if you're interested in, I'm sure he can tell you all about it afterwards. And in his talk, Laz will focus on his experiences doing research during the pandemic as a master's student. And that includes both the problems and challenges that he faced, but also what research opportunities actually emerged in the context of the pandemic. And all of this from the perspective of a GSSS student like yourselves. I'll ask the speakers to the floor in this sequence. And after they've all spoken, we'll first give the panelists a chance to react to each other, and then we'll open up the floor. I'm hoping we can have a lively conversation with you guys, with also input from the internet. And after we conclude the formal part here, there'll be an opportunity to continue the conversation informally at the Crea Café. Hopefully it stays dry and we can be outside. So, welcome again, and I give the floor to Joyeeta Gupta.
How do I get it on the screen?
Joyeeta, can you begin without the slide?
I can begin without the sliders, but it's a bit of a pity. So basically, welcome everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 and climate change. And you're probably wondering, what is the connection between COVID-19 and climate change? So what I'm going to try to do is, while the screen is coming up, I'll tell you a little bit about the fact that when you look at the way we live, we all use energy, right? So you're probably coming by bus to work sometimes, you're probably driving a car. It's all using fossil fuels. And this fossil fuel is extremely problematic because it causes or is part of the cause of climate change. Now, what I want to talk a little bit about is the fact that in the report that Annette mentioned, the Global Environment Outlook, in that report, we focused on the relationship between a healthy planet and healthy people. And what we basically said is, if you look at the planet today, it's worth around $125 trillion. Do you know how much the global GDP is? $86 trillion. So if you calculate the environment and its worth, and even though you don't actually buy or sell the environment, it's worth much more than the global GDP. On the other hand, let me give you another statistic. How much do you think the whole fossil fuel enterprise is worth? Take a guess. 10 trillion, he says. Now that's very conservative, and maybe you are absolutely right. But he would be right if he could phase out fossil fuel in, say, 10 years. But if people who have oil want to become rich from oil, then they're probably going to say, I'm going to sell every bit of oil that there is on earth. And so they're going to probably calculate that they have around, they're probably going to calculate that it's about 300 trillion, which is a lot more money, which basically means that no matter how much we negotiate in Paris or anywhere else, the chance that we can phase out fossil fuel is very, very small. This is where COVID might play a role. So what we're trying to see in this report of the Healthy Planet, Healthy People is that every year, more than 9 million people worldwide die from air pollution and water pollution, and many more are affected. And we also found that 60% of all infectious disease actually comes from animals in some way or the other. And that's pretty much like COVID. COVID probably has changed that statistic massively now. But since that report, since we emphasized that the reduction in national parks is leading to a greater contact between humans and animals, and that might lead to greater exposure to these new kinds of sicknesses, what does that mean now for climate change? Now, you probably know, as Annette has already told you, and I'm now going to depart completely from my speech, but as Annette has already told you, well, most of us are not coming to the university. That basically means that the flights have stopped more or less, the transport has stopped, recreation has stopped, tourism has stopped, and that means that the entire fossil fuel industry is coming slowly to a standstill. This means that petrol pumps can't sell their petrol. It means that the extractive industry that's taking out all this oil and gas, etc., is unable to actually sell that because that's not, no one's buying it. And so suddenly there's a fall in the prices of these fossil fuels, right? So I told you it was 300 trillion, and we know that if we want to solve the climate change problem, we must leave around 60 to 80% of this fossil fuel underground. Now, most developing countries would be shocked if you ask them to leave that fossil fuel underground because they think they will become rich if they use it, right? Are you with me? Yeah? The oil-rich countries became rich because they were able to sell the oil. So many of these countries are afraid that if they don't use this fossil fuel, they will not be able to develop. And we ourselves in the north are unwilling to give up this fossil fuel. I mean, you can just listen to what presidents of nearby countries say across the ocean. So, COVID-19 has led to a situation where this fossil fuel bubble, this valuation we have of the fossil fuel enterprise, that is slowly being punctured because of our inability to go to work or to go on holiday far away. This means that if we are clever, that when we rebuild society, we can make sure that the rebuilding is focused on renewables and not on fossils. So let me just give you an example. I understand that 18% of the global GDP, well, the statistics go from 10% to 20%, but most likely it's between 17 and 18% of global GDP will be spent to rebuild the global economy. This means that governments are going to pump in tax money to bring industry back on its feet. And the question over here is, will our governments have the guts to support the renewable energy industry rather than the fossil fuel industry? Will our governments have the guts to support the electric car and the electric bus rather than the fossil fuel financed bus? And of course, it's going to cost all of us money, because if I have a diesel car and I have to move to an electric car, that's jolly expensive. So of course, it's going to have cost on society. But if the government would use this kind of money worldwide to move in another direction, it might be quite useful. So COVID-19 may have a little bit of a silver lining for the climate change problem. And you all know that the climate change problem is so severe that we really have to run to solve the problem in the next 10 to 30 years. And this is not the moment for us to tell Ghana or Kenya or Mozambique, why don't you use your new fossil fuel? Because if they start to extract that new fossil fuel, then they're stuck. Do you understand? Because then they will create an extractive industry. They will create users and producers and consumers, and then they will get locked in. Do you know the term locked in? Yeah? So they get locked into this whole process, and then it may become like us, and they won't be able to change their perceptions of how the world looks. So essentially, I'm not going to go through all the sheets, but essentially, if you look at the global problems in the environmental field, and if you have on the x-axis privileged people to marginalize, and on the y-axis the contribution to environmental problems, you find privileged people like us over here in this room, not the students perhaps, but us, the teachers. We are privileged, and we probably are the biggest polluters. So in some ways, this year, the University of Amsterdam is polluting much less than we normally did. And on the other hand, it's the poor and the marginalized that are contributing the least to environmental problems. And when you look at who's going to be affected by the risks and the impacts of climate change, it's almost always the poorer countries and the poorer people who will be impacted, because Annette and I could probably fly to another place and settle down, right? And so that's the dilemma, that those who cause the problem are not necessarily those who are affected by the problem. And so essentially what's happened in the Western world and in the developing world is that we are caught in this vicious cycle where we are all basically externalizing the environment to become richer and richer all the time, and we are essentially focusing on a lean state, a state that doesn't regulate very much. We are focusing on scapegoats, you know, it's a Chinese disease as some people call it. So you're focusing on scapegoats, not real solutions. You're focusing on the rich rather than the vulnerable. And essentially what you find is that we are locked up in this vicious cycle. And I'm going to cut short my presentation a little bit to show you where we are. I said to you earlier that we have to phase out fossil fuels. About 80% has to be phased out. So that's very expensive. That's the big financial problem that we have. And the big other issue with fossil fuels is that suppose now I want to get rid of my fossil fuel shares, and so do all of them. If we all throw our fossil fuel shares in the market, the price will collapse. So we will not earn any money. So what's happening is people are selling these fossil fuel shares behind closed doors. And sometimes actors in the developing world are buying these shares because they think they will become rich. But maybe they won't. That's if the bubble bursts. And so this is the bubble that we have right now, because the COVID-19 crisis is bringing share prices down, shareholder equity, companies are closing, the capital expenditures are being reduced. So if that bubble, that full bubble that we see there, if that bubble of 300 trillion is slowly going to be shrunk, then we see a a chance that it may be possible that governments can move to invest in other arenas. So basically, I have 4 scenarios for you. I have what is called a socially inclusive scenario and an ecologically inclusive scenario at this corner. And in that scenario, when the governments put their money in to rebuild society, they focus on fossil fuel substitutes, they focus on the laid off fossil fuel employees, but not the CEOs, of course, and then they try to subsidize all kinds of fuel switches. And you can also, of course, have a socially and ecologically exclusive bundle where the governments just prop up the fossil fuel sector. So basically, I'm arguing in favor of a virtuous cycle. This is the only time the world is going to put in such a large amount of money to build back better. But we don't want to build back better. We want to catalyze change. So we want to actually go towards a new virtuous cycle. And I don't know about other people, but about myself, I've really enjoyed the fact that I didn't have to travel so much. I've enjoyed the fact that I didn't have to come to work every day, and I still had contact with my students. And I think my footprint has gone down quite a bit. So I'm feeling quite proud of that. And I think when this COVID-19 is over, I'm going to seriously rethink how much I travel. And still try to give you an enjoyable learning experience. My stick has got stuck, so I'm going to leave it to whoever is in charge and move on to the next person. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Okay, so I have to say that I biked here today because I didn't want to take a train. So I guess I'm following in the hopeful message here given by Joyeeta. And this doesn't work. Did you say that?
This is stopped.
It stopped working. Well, so then you have to ponder the vicious cycle. No, the virtuous cycle while listening to me about something completely different. So I'm an anthropologist. Anthropology is the scientific study of humans, human behavior, and societies in the past and the present. Cultural anthropologists study patterns of behavior, cultural meaning, including norms and values. And here at the University of Amsterdam, we really focus on things like the circulation of people and things, images, ideas. We study changes in experiences of health and experience of well-being. The social consequences of the growing mobility of people and goods, and the changing networks of solidarity, knowledge, and power. Lots of stuff. So COVID-19, obviously, it's working maybe. Obviously, my slides aren't that important. I can just go on. Affected all of these aspects without any doubt. So studies of crisis and disasters often sort of show the underlying structures, habits, practices that are in a society, which is for anthropologists interesting, maybe even an opportunity to learn something. COVID-19 then allows for some sort of critical investigation of society, the society in which we live, and the choices that we've made and that brought us here. But it doesn't take an anthropologist, as Joyeeta just showed, to see that COVID-19 has shown us how the society that we live in actually can really quickly change, and if we want to, and that such change is possible. COVID has pointed us to the fact that reality is not just as is, and that normalcy does not have to be accepted as is, but that instead this society, this reality that we dwell in, is a cultural construction. Something that is changeable, something that's malleable. And knowing this, the question that Joyeeta already posed is, do we dare to dream for a better future? Do we dare to dream of a more just society where inequalities are lessened? So we studied people since half of April who probably have been dreaming of a better future, have been dreaming of another world in which they had a place that is different from what it is, where they have been so far. Our Department of Anthropology and funded, as already was explained by Son and Wei, my colleague Jeanette Pols and I started to organize a group of researchers from various institutions who had worked with what we call socially vulnerable groups. And social vulnerability here relates to the degree to which people are able to anticipate, to cope with, to resist and recover from the impact of something like COVID-19 as stressors. And also another stressor in this case is maybe even the policies of physical distancing and shielding that have been prevalent as a result of COVID. So we wanted to understand how these people were faring during the lockdown periods, what problems did they encounter, what solutions they needed, and then we tried to communicate this to policymakers. So it was a very applied, very short research study. So as a result, we got a whole consortium together of organizations, and I think there are actually slides. That's so exciting. Let's see if I can go to, how do I go to the next one? That's another question. Aim there, that's a good start. Oh, look at that. Yes, so here are the organizations that collaborated in this study, and you can see there's organizations that are universities on the one hand, on the other hand there are organizations that are really about applied work with these populations themselves. And we needed these kind of organizations because we had a week to put it together. Within 2 weeks we had to be running with this study. And so we needed organizations that worked with groups that were socially vulnerable or marginalized. And particularly the question that Sonnenweg came and brought to us was, can you work with older people? Because we know older people are vulnerable. And so we took that, we brought those people in, and we also expanded it a little bit to other populations. And they're listed here, you can see them here on the left are older people. I think it's hard to look at this and be in a microphone at the same time. But you can see there are people, older people that live independently, as well as people in care and nursing homes. We worked with people with disabilities, with learning disabilities, people with severe psychiatric problems, homeless people, and we also included families with young children because we were interested in how they were faring, and also professionals dealing with issues of domestic violence. So in totally, we had about 244 people that we repeatedly interviewed. We talked to them over time, again and again. In addition, we worked together with sociologists who conducted 2 surveys, one among about 2,500 residents, family members and professionals that worked with working with the nursing care, with health facilities where they were residing, nursing and care facilities, I should say, and another survey with about 1,500 older people who lived independently. So we studied these people from half of April through the end of July, and this is what we found. Let's see if that works. Yes. So this is Groningen during the lockdown, and it's an empty street. And during this period, which was actually, I think in the Netherlands was still relatively light. The lockdown was a voluntary lockdown. I called it an intelligent lockdown. I never quite figured out what was so intelligent, but it sounded good, and I felt good about it. The experience of people that we studied can be typified by a contrast between, on the one hand, relative rest and calm, and on the other hand, emptiness and loneliness. And for a number of the people, the sudden disappearance of the demands and stimuli of normal society proved to be actually a positive experience. Moreover, for the first time in their lives, many experienced a sense of solidarity. Suddenly everyone was socially isolated, as they had been. Think about a homeless person with a very small social network, very socially isolated. And suddenly everybody was living in uncertainty, living in fear, having anxiety. And there's a slide that there. One of the respondents said, "Quote, that there is now a mutual understanding among the people. I hope that one is confronted with difficult things. We're all in the same boat, and that is sort of positive. A strange connectedness at 1.5 meter distance, but still a connection." On the other hand, this period was one in which social contact got even less. Day programs, which are essential for these people to the normal functioning of many of the people we studied, had stopped, while new digital contact for many did not solve all issues. It's really difficult to have a connection with somebody through Zoom, particularly if you need to help people do daily household tasks. That's impossible. So a lack of perspective and emptiness was what dominated. One homeless person told us, "I am only thinking backwards." So the emptiness experienced had an existential quality to it for these people. All the people were reminded of the Second World War, feeling suffocated by being locked up, wondering when the bombs would be falling again on the streets. And people were actually sort of saying these things about, it's almost like I'm hearing the bombs falling. And many other people, in particularly in nursing and care homes, were afraid to die, which is not because of COVID, but because of their loved ones that couldn't be there for them, couldn't be there with them if it would happen. So within all this group that we studied, people suffered there was a lot of fear, a lot of worsening of psychiatric complaints and increased social tensions. And then there were some on the other side that actually found some peace. And it really, of course, it's a very diverse group. It kind of depends on who we're talking about. But it was a mixed image. But it was interesting how it impacted these people way harsher than I think the general population. So the period of relaxation, which came, I think, in the Netherlands at the end of May, ironically did not bring a way out for the people who were suffering from this population. The progressive relaxation of policy measures meant that a constant adaptation was needed to new rules. And that was very difficult. If you have a learning disability, if it's difficult to understand what's going on around you, then again and again and again, new rules, new ideas, new thoughts, try to adapt to that. And moreover, there was a sense of a rising inequality. Because while for the general public, social life started again, the terraces opened, you could see people go outside, and the same people were also a little bit less busy with adhering to the social distancing rules. We're just getting back to normal. We want to get back to normal. And that, of course, is visible. It's visible to somebody who is really afraid, who is very afraid. And as a result, some of the people we studied continue to stay home, shielding themselves from the rest of society. And public transportation was shunned, and that further reduced their mobility. This is what one person said. Most of life is at a standstill. I cannot do anything anymore. And by another, it just goes on. That's the feeling that I'm having. So what does this teach us? The policies of the pandemic had, particularly in the beginning, only been based on a meaning and interpretation of safety that comes from a biomedical perspective. Safety means prevention of infection. It means preventing chaos at the intensive care, the dreaded black scenario where you have to choose who to give care and who you don't. And this makes sense, of course. But safety is a broader concept. Safety is also, particularly for the groups that we studied, a social issue, a social problem, a social dimension that relates to general well-being. And not just general well-being, we're talking about essential well-being. For the groups we studied in particular, safety in the form of social contact with care workers, with kin, with friends, and other social connections appeared to be essential to a minimum quality of life. The absence of such social contact as a result of the lockdown measures with care workers and family, for many was too rigorous, it was too harsh, it was too lonely, and it was too long. An emotional loneliness dominated, typified by an emptiness and loss of close connections with people around them. And particularly for those isolated in nursing homes, this impact has been really harsh. And I think there's been a lot of attention to that worldwide, the nursing and care homes. By the way, also informal carers, people who take care of older people, for example, they also struggled a lot. A lot of them, and this is not just older people, it's also psychiatric people or that need other kinds of care, because it often fell on the shoulders of one of those persons, because the others were retracted. Only one person could go, maybe, if possible at all, and so that one person had a growing responsibility, but it was very difficult. So during any lockdown, we believe there's a balance that needs to be maintained between safety as preventing infection and safety as promoting social well-being and quality of life for those who need it the most. And survey data that our sociology colleagues, also from the Trimbus Institute, collected from family members and professionals in nursing homes, sort of typify this balance. When they asked what they found, what the respondents found more important, quality of life, which means in this case access to kin, and because they were in a lockdown and nobody was able to come, or perfection of invention, 41% of family members chose for quality of life, as you can see on the top one in blue, and 31% of family members chose for infection prevention, shown in orange. For professionals, which is below there, zorgmedewerkers, 26% chose for quality of life in blue, and 39% chose for infection prevention in orange. Yet both groups, about 1/3 could not make a decision at all. And this is because it is not one or the other, it's both. And it's a very difficult choice to make. And what this implies is that there's something essential about social life, about social traffic, that is needed for quality of life for these groups. Particularly for people who deal with anxiety, with violence, with loneliness, and lack of a future perspective. It also is important for the professional caregivers who need social contact to monitor and signal what's going on, building trusting relationships, access to assess the problems that people are having, and help people with daily tasks. So as a closing note, what maybe one thing that we need right now, for at least for this group of people, and maybe for society as a whole, is to look at the role of cultural institutions in bridging this gap. And it's interesting because you can see in the media that it's just these very kind of institutions that get cut in their subsidies, and they don't get extra aid, and they're the last in the line. But at the same time, they're the ones that bring meaning back to life. Meaning that is so very necessary, has been so very necessary for certain groups who feel disconnected, who feel very socially isolated. So we hope that there will be room, that maybe there can be more room for cultural events to bring this needed care, meaning and cohesiveness back to those people that we studied. And we thank all the people we studied, and also I'm speaking on behalf of a lot of people who are listed over here. So if you want to know more about this, oh, now it's gone. Oh yeah, about our research project, this is the website, www.coronatijden.nl. Check it out, and yeah, we are also probably would like to continue this work, but as the funding is done for, hopefully we can continue it with support of some students. So contact us if you want to. Thank you.
Can I take this off? No, it's already off, but thanks. Yeah, that's me. Also on behalf of me, welcome to the university. As you probably understood from the earlier presentations, here at the University of Amsterdam, we tend to pride ourselves in working on this cross-section between theory, scholarly methods, but also real-life challenges, real-life problems. And in a way, almost in a perverse way, that's also why scholars like us don't let this crisis go to waste. There is this old saying, and how awful it is, when there is a crisis, we try to deal with the crisis, we try to learn from that crisis and try to gather more knowledge that we can implement into dealing with that crisis. The same goes for political scientists. Over the last few months, my colleagues in political science have engaged in research into, for instance, how lobby groups respond to the crisis, to the lockdown, or how European countries try to collaborate, for instance, in getting funding for a vaccine, or not. They show less solidarity, for instance, when it comes to the finances internationally. I myself thought, well, I'm going to sit this one out. But then, due to very weird circumstances, I suddenly got engaged into a research project dealing with this specific crisis. Specifically, it was about the rally around the flag. What is the rally around the flag? Well, as most of you probably have noticed in your respective countries, there has been a rising support for political leaders, for prime ministers, for presidents. You see that not only in countries that have responded quite well to the crisis, like New Zealand, but also in countries that have faced more difficulties or were at the forefront of the first wave of the epidemic. You even see it in the United States in the first few weeks when the pandemic arrived there, that there was this boost in support for Donald Trump. You saw it in France, in the United Kingdom, you saw it in the Netherlands. You didn't see it that much in Brazil, but it might also be because, well, Bolsonaro himself said there was no such thing as a pandemic reaching Brazilian shores for a long time. You can see this rising support for these political leaders, for presidents and prime ministers specifically, in a lot of graphs and tables. This is a graph from a colleague of mine from the United Kingdom, Will Jennings, who put some information in a line, and you see this boost in trust after the 11th of March in a lot of countries. But again, look at Bolsonaro. What color is that? Well, green-bluish. We didn't see this increase. But what does that mean? What does that tell us? Well, a rally around the flag, as the literature tells us, is something quite specific. It's not just any boost in political trust, but it's a boost in political authorities and institutions, specifically in response to a sudden, externally driven national crisis. So basically there's a crisis, and as a response, trust goes up. The crisis has to be sudden, unexpected. You haven't seen it coming for a very long time. It also should be externally driven, in the sense that the political authorities, the institutions, could not have prevented that, or they are not part of the problem. They're not part of the reason that there is this crisis, at least in the view of the people. And it should be a national crisis. It should not just be a small segment of society dealing with a problem or the political party itself. It should be a national crisis. And then you can see this boost. This is not a new phenomenon. There have been quite a few. In fact, according to some estimations, in the United States alone, you can see like 3 rally rounds the flag every year. But not all of them are as big. There are some very typical rallies around the flag. For instance, in the top left, you see the Iraq War, the early one in 1991, where there was this external crisis, Iraq invading Kuwait, and the United States stepping in. It was perceived as a national crisis because the international order was being undermined, the first major war after the end of the Cold War. The biggest and most typical one is the 9/11 attacks. The attacks on the World Trade Center led to a huge boost in political trust in George W. Bush, for instance, but this boost occurred across Western democracies. Here in the Netherlands, too, we saw a big boost in political trust in our government in response to the attacks that occurred in the United States. Another example that didn't occur in every country is the Great Recession, the start of the Great Recession in 2008, when some banks fell over. Well, in the Netherlands, one of the banks that fell over was our national pride, ABN, that had been taken over and bought by Belgians just, I think, the year before. And then our government stepped in decisively to buy back the bank and ensure that people could keep their money. Again, a national crisis leading to a big boost in political trust. What didn't lead to a rally around the flag, by contrast, is the bottom right example. What we saw there was Hurricane Katrina. Anyone remember Hurricane Katrina? You might even be too young for that. It's always so weird to feel so old. But it was in the mid-zeros. A hurricane reached American shores. And there was great devastation. But that didn't lead to this boost in trust. Why not? Well, it could have been prevented to some extent. The biggest problems could have been prevented. And once the hurricane had hit the shores, then government could have stepped in sooner, and it didn't. So then it did not lead to a boost in political trust, but rather the inverse. Emphasizing that the threat should not just be external, but it should also be external in the sense that government cannot help it. Now with this COVID-19 pandemic, this has all the facets of this externally driven crisis, a national crisis. The question is, to political scientists, however, we see this boost in trust. We know it's a rally around the flag, but what drives this rally around the flag? What's going on here? Some say the rally around the flag is induced by Italy, And when the Italian lockdown began, that's the moment when trust got this boost across countries, even here in the Netherlands, for instance. Others say, no, it has everything to do with the number of national infections and the number of national deaths. That leads to a boost in trust, so it's a national threat. And even others argue, no, it's not either of them. It's in fact, once national policies are being implemented towards a lockdown, once the national lockdown starts, then people realize this is a real threat, and therefore they become trusting. I'll come back to this issue later, because this has major implications for how we understand democratic policy making. But what all this information that we've learned until now doesn't help us understand is what drives this rally around the flag. There are a lot of theories about that. It should be driven by fear or anxiety or by anger. It should be patriotism, being proud of how we can respond and how we stand together. It should mainly be a consequence of media suddenly becoming slaves towards government, agreeing to all the policies that they propose, in response to which people agree to that. But the truth of the matter is we don't really know why these external threats drive up trust. And I have some ideas about that. I want to test them for a long time already, but I couldn't. So I had this idea, well, we need to be sure that this rally around the flag really focuses only on government and the executive rather than all types of authorities. But we don't really know. We had a hypothesis lying out there whether voters follow their party cues, so that the voters of government parties are more likely to experience this boost in trust, but voters for opposition parties or populist parties might not. We simply didn't know yet, because this trend was only observed at the aggregate level. We do not know whether this trend is driven by fear, as I would have expected and suspected beforehand, or by pride, or by anger, or something else. And finally, we do not know which groups change. Are the more skeptical persons who respond to behavior the ones that are most likely to become more trusting? Or are it the people that are most ambivalent? Or in fact, are the most cynical people the ones that become more trusting in the sense that they become less cynical? So there are all these questions still lying around that were quite necessary to understand what this rally around the flag is and the implications that it has for democracy as a whole. But as I said, I thought I would sit this one out. In fact, I had been building towards a survey on political trust for 2 years and had to keep on delaying that because of the United Kingdom and their whole Brexit plans that kept on being delayed. Britain is one of the countries in my survey. And because they constantly had these major debates on Brexit and they didn't want that to influence my survey, I kept on delaying and delaying and delaying my survey until I had to go into the field in the beginning of March. And of course, 1 week after starting, then the pandemic became official in Western Europe, even in my countries, so I had to pull out again. And I was very sad about that. This was like a 2-year prep. And then after 2 weeks, I decided, you know what? I have some data now on the Dutch and a little bit of data on the British citizens. If I can connect that to COVID-19, suddenly I've got the ultimate data set. Because what we never have in these types of situations, we never have measurements before the crisis. I suddenly had panel data, or create panel data, where I had collected information about people 1 week before the pandemic became official in the Netherlands. That's the best starting point for your research in a way. It was pure luck. This wasn't planned. But now that I had the data, I continue doing that. So basically I had data 1 week before the lockdown started in the Netherlands. It wasn't even the biggest lockdown yet. That would start a few weeks later. And then I decided, well, let's do a second wave. Among the very same people, I'm going to interview them a second time. And I did that by the end of April, the beginning of May. Again, in pure luck, only after my fieldwork period ended, the lockdown got relieved to a tiny extent. So this was the best period possible to test my ideas. I had about 2,000 respondents that participated both times. And I did, well, quantitative methods. I'm not going to bother you with those methodological details for now. Now, what did I find? During that time span, from early to mid-March to late April, early May, I saw this rally around the flag, but I only saw that for trust in government. For trust in parliament, it was also there, but a little bit weaker. But I didn't find the effect for the police and for the courts. It's just the political institutions that experienced this boost in trust. So it is a very specific response by people. People also became more satisfied with democracy, by the way, during the same time span. But if you want to understand what's going on here, well, I did all these tests, and I had some remarkable findings. First of all, the boost in trust is not rooted in the ideas of their party leaders. You would expect that the voters for the radical right in the Netherlands, the populist radical right parties, that they would not experience this boost in trust. Why not? Well, their own party leaders said, everything this government is doing in response to this crisis is wrong. Before there was a lockdown, the problem was, according to their party leaders, that there was no lockdown. As soon as there was a lockdown implemented in the Netherlands, the problem was that the lockdown should be lifted. So you would expect that their voters respond to those cues. We found the inverse. In fact, we found the biggest boost in trust among voters for the radical right and among non-voters. And I can explain later why. Secondly, we found that it's not ambivalence, persons that already were a little bit ambivalent about politics who showed the biggest boost in trust, but rather it's the persons that were more cynical. Anxiety or fear is a very strong driving factor. In fact, we found that being very afraid of being infected, or even the slightest bit afraid of being infected, you or your family or your friends, led to the very big boost in political trust. If you were not afraid, there was hardly any boost. So fear is an important driver of the rally around the flag. And it's particularly the cynical people that become more trusting. If you beforehand think that politicians cannot be trusted because they do not care about you or because they are incompetent, then you're more likely to experience this boost in political trust. That's counterintuitive in a way, but you suddenly face a reality where you see that the politicians do care, or at the very least your interests align. And you see that they are able to come to policies that to some extent deal with the problems. Sorry, that's going too fast. Now this has quite a few implications for what's going on out there in real life. Now we know from this crisis that fear is an important driving factor of trust. The weird thing is, fear is heightened, or the realization of the threat is heightened by the existence or the coming into existence of policies dealing with the threat. That's weird. So people only become very much aware of the threat once policies are being implemented to deal with that threat. But that leads to a boost in political trust. It's almost circular, but this to some extent explains why, particularly in more authoritarian countries, leaders are so well able to keep trust on relatively high levels by constantly appointing external threats that they alone can deal with. Why they implement policies quite regularly to deal with these external threats. That's a way to keep boosting trust. It also explains why this doesn't work at the moment, for instance, in the United States, where external threats keep being, pointed out by the president, but it doesn't lead to a renewed boost in trust, simply because all those threats were already there. They were partly his responsibility. And we know that the rally around the flag doesn't work if you are being seen as partly culpable for those threats. So what you can learn from this rally around the flag, specifically on this pandemic, is that threats lead to a boost in trust. And if you can manage threats and manage your policies in response to those threats, particularly with externally driven crises, external scapegoats, that might be a rather perverse but good way to deal with legitimacy. We can also turn this around in a more positive sense, but that's a question I'm going to ask later. How can we deal with the climate crisis as an external threat, leading to potentially more support for specific policies in the short run? Because if we keep on delaying this and delaying this and delaying this, then we might fall in the very same trap that Trump and Bolsonaro are falling in with COVID-19. at one point the threat is no longer external, then you are partly responsible for that threat. So people won't buy into your policies anymore. But that's a question for the debate.
I have no idea how to use it, but let's see how much of a disaster that's going to be. To the right, perfect. Yeah, I think I'm a terrible person because I came with a tram here today, so I think I'm not working on my footprint very well. But yeah, let's see. Yeah. I want to talk mostly about how my own research was. It's not about COVID, but it did happen at exactly the beginning of the pandemic. And let's dive into it. A little bit about the research premise of everything that I focus mostly. My project focused primarily on the expression of mental distress and resilience among men who have sex with men, MSN, in short, in Paramaribo, in Suriname, so in South America, very small country. A bit more about it, so how I envisioned it is that I chose Suriname as my fieldwork site due to the coexistence of multiple ethnic and religious groups in this post-colonial Surinamese society, and the multiplicity of ethnicity and religion and religiosity, and as well as contrasting views on homosexuality and same-sex attraction in the context of Suriname, as well as how all these elements intersect with one another, painted a particularly intriguing picture to me, so I thought it would be a great site. Just to keep in mind, there were, of course, fears from the whole department that we don't really know what's going to happen with Corona, but nobody was really stopped from doing research, so we were all quite optimistic back then in January. I theorized for my project that depending on the unique identity and background of every one of my informants, I would observe a variety of expressions of distress and resilience. And therefore, interacting face-to-face with my informants was very crucial. Yeah, the first COVID cases happened a little bit approximately 3 to 4 weeks after I first moved to the area. So I stayed in Paramaribo for over a month, and I was collecting data partly online using gay social networking apps and mostly meeting face to face with his men. And that is exactly when COVID-19 reached Suriname. I was specifically on a brief mid-field work vacation to Aruba, but at the same time I was also renewing my visa because it was quite complicated, so it was very handy for me to just leave the context for a little bit, get a new pass, and come back. But that was not meant to happen in my case. That was the moment that the Surinamese government closed the borders, but so did Aruba, in a way. So I was a little bit stranded in the Atlantic Ocean, kind of. So for some days, there was a huge confusion from all sides about what is going to happen with me, my research, my future generally. All of my belongings were still back in South America, in Suriname. I was not. And so was all my fieldwork equipment, so thousands of euros worth of belongings. Yeah. That is the next one. Generally, I have to say that during my stay in Paramaribo, I created a network of informants which remained active also after my urgent departure from South America. And moreover, the same network proved very useful during the pandemic since my informants wanted to actively help once I kind of shared with them, well, all of that. And it was, in my opinion, very interesting because they even offered to safeguard my belongings in Paramaribo. They offered to help me recruit more participants, which was the original plan in any case. But I think, in a way, connecting to what Danny mentioned before, there was a sense of connectedness between all of us because they were facing issues in their everyday lives as well, obviously. Suriname had a very strict lockdown. After only one case, they shut down the borders completely and the deployed army on the borders with French Guyana. Therefore, everyone's life was very affected, and this sense of that we are through all of that together also helped bringing us together. Next door. Yes. I want to talk next. Yeah, it's a little bit uncomfortable, right? It's cool. I want to talk next about the transition to virtual ethnography. So as I said, I was planning to use dating apps and social networking apps as an initial point of entry to my research population, which indeed happened. But since everything else happened as well with Corona, I started using it as a more permanent base of finding people and communicating with people. So even though there were virtual ethnographic elements in my research to begin with, after my unanticipated early departure, there was a total shift towards an online approach. That meant that I needed to use complementary methods and approaches in order to make sure that my data will be satisfactory. For example, most of the interviews scheduled in Paramaribo took place online instead of face-to-face. And luckily, I knew most of my informants already, but some were men I just never met before, except for our online interactions. In an attempt to enrich my data, but also to nurture a relationship with them, I created an online survey that functioned as an initial contact with the informants I just didn't know beforehand. And additionally, I started our interactions with an introduction of who I am, what my research is about, what my own background is, and I consecutively asked them if there is anything more they would like to know. And with most men, we also spoke through messages before arranging interviews. And this way, by the time we started with the interviewing process, we had already established a certain relationship that was very helpful during the interviews. So in a way, I'm using this kind of be creative, be flexible thing on my slides, but I don't want to come across as preachy. For me, it was a good call to be creative when I was conducting my fieldwork, because I was not particularly interested in virtual ethnographies before that, but I was forced in facilitating such methods. Therefore, I got a whole part of education through this master that I was never expecting I was going to get. So there's a silver lining also for you as social scientists. I want to read this. Can I just grab that? Yeah, no? Well, I hope you hear me. The quote says, the unexpected consequences of doing research during a pandemic. Oh, perfect. Okay. The unexpected consequence of doing research during a pandemic in this case was not only that the pandemic functioned as a challenge, but also as a call to be more creative in order to tackle that exact challenge. The pandemic also highlighted the significance of being flexible and resourceful during one's fieldwork. It was a great chance to get educated in alternative, or at least in mixed forms of data collection in the field and conducting anthropological research in general. I think for me, it was quite interesting because I was just, as I said, never anticipating to do something like that. So I was pretty happy it kind of worked the way it did. There it is. Another issue that immediately occurred during my research and once I arrived in Europe is that I was just literally not in South America anymore. And that meant not only that I couldn't see my informants face to face and spend time with them, but also that I was out of time, not only out of space. As I previously mentioned, I had to move very urgently, so most of my informants for the first couple of weeks, they didn't even know what happened to me because it was very complicated. I instantly anticipated certain effects, but the combination of a 5-hour difference between the two countries and not being able to see each other, it took definitely a toll on my own research. So for example, let's say that my informants would finish work around 6 or 7. That would mean that in Amsterdam, that was already 11 or 12 in the night. So I did have to conduct interviews also in midnight, for example, or at my own house online, being careful so that most of my housemates wouldn't hear what we're saying, confidentiality and everything. So it was immediately clear to me that not only you need to be creative and flexible, but also you need to be able to adjust and you need to be able to adapt to these new conditions because they were just unprecedented for all students and faculty. There was indeed a silver lining, and in the case of my research, it was mostly about people opening up, as I mentioned earlier. So a lot of the participants of the research experienced mental distress, and that was some of you might know that already, but in a lot of South American countries and in the Caribbean, talking about mental health can be often a big taboo, so people just avoid the topic altogether. What I found very interesting is that the international character of the pandemic made opening up easier due to its global presence. And in a way, it seemed that sharing anything related to mental health and emotional issues was directly less of a taboo, making these topics much more accessible also when discussing with informants. Another example of an emerging opportunity is the use of certain language during the online at-home interviews. As I said before, many interviews were at home during the online meetings that we had. So the presence of their family in the room, for instance, also called for their language to be adjusted. They wouldn't use certain words like gay, bi, or sex, but at the same time, you could hear differences in terms of the tone and the volume, and all of that in a way added, you could always tell when someone else was in the room, and this added ethnographic richness to my data, since I was able to notice such dynamics that otherwise I may not have access to if I was physically in Paramaribo, in Suriname, doing participant observation. The anthropologists there will know what that is. I probably wouldn't have access to that. I wouldn't be able to be in their houses with their families and see how they interact about these things. But with online methods, I did get a chance to do that. And I tried to rush because I didn't know how much time we have. I think more or less that's all I have to say. I do have, I am co-authoring at a medical anthropology blog that I started with a classmate of mine. So if you guys want to learn more, I don't know if the presentation is going to be available online, but I put a link there so you can check it out. You can read more details about the drama and the story, and both personal and professional details. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Laz, and thanks to all the speakers. I'm really impressed with all the creative adjusting going on around here. Also to the technical difficulties you've creatively adjusted. Thank you for that, and apologies. Maybe we can now move back into a half circle. Tom, if you could join us, because before opening up to your questions and comments, I want to give the panelists a chance to react to each other if they would like, to comment or ask each other anything.
Just to follow up on what he said, I think the way we do research will change. I found that my students were able to do so much research with online databases on the remunicipalization of water services, with the court cases online, and now you've been able to do virtual ethnography that sounds completely mind-boggling. That one can do that. But on the other hand, you know, I find myself in my lectures in the bedrooms of my students because they don't have a study room. And on the one hand, I don't want to go get that close to them because I don't want to know that they have certain problems, that they don't have a study and that they're sharing the room with 5 other people or whatever. And on the other hand, there is a closer contact that you have with somebody because you immediately see the person in a setting. And it's different from seeing you guys in the room here because you can't see where you are in the world and what you're doing. So it will change the way we teach. And I think that came out very nicely in your presentation. And you have a question, and I'm happy.
if I may first respond to this very same issue, you'll probably realize over the next year that it's much more difficult in these settings to be very interactive. In the classes during this year are probably less interactive than we would have liked them to be. But at the same time, you see from the point of view of students and of the teachers that we basically try to grab onto anything that gives us more opportunities to have these interactions with the students. Be it when you guys sit from home or if there are physical meetings, we still enjoy the interaction. So please help us try to get there. The worst thing that we might have is this silent internet chat room where we all sit behind blinded videos. We don't see each other and we just try to receive. Try to keep stuff as interactive as possible. And over the last half year, I saw so many stimulating examples of how this can work. We have to make the best of what we have, but I think we can do it together. Sorry for being preachy.
Okay, so I guess you were asked your question in a second, but for one thing that I noticed with the population that we studied is that digital contact, yes, it's good and it helps bridge the gap. At the same time, there's limitations to it, and one of the major limitation was the building of trust, particularly with people you don't know yet. And I think that's why it's so nice to see some real audience here, for example, but it's really important that I hope that you'll have a chance to actually meet face to face first and get to know each other a little bit in real life before we go back to our digital normal. It seems to be more normal now than actually seeing each other in life. So I think that's I hope that's and I know Annette and the graduate school is really working hard to get you here. So I hope that that works well. Since I have the microphone, may I ask a question? Because I was listening to both your stories, and one thing that really struck me is that there seems to be in both cases a window of opportunity right now with COVID-19, and I'm curious, like, when does that window close? Because before we know it, right now we can think, we can dream big, and we see that things can be different. But at some point, the powers that have been and that are going to reclaim their territory, and when things go back to normal, which we may want to resist, by the way, is that idea, right? Because we may not want it to go back to that very same normal, which is something that I think particularly Joyeeta was already also arguing for. But when does that process of the powers that be, drawing it all back into how it used to be, when does that start, and what can we do to resist that, to stop that? That's my question for both of you, actually, because it also is about the surprise events.
Yeah, so if you think about the window of opportunities, you really need to consider what type of resources have become available in response to the crisis. That opened up that window, that can lead to change. In my presentation, I focused very specifically on trust. And we know that this boost in trust in the short run leads to a bigger willingness to accept policies and to a bigger level of law abidingness. But the rally around the flag effect, this legitimacy boost, is quite short-lived in the sense that in a few weeks or in a few months after it starts, it already starts to end. In the United States, the rally around the flag lasted only for a very short few weeks. In Brazil, it hardly ever existed. In the Netherlands, it's now already ebbing, it's waning. And we are not even half a year after the start of the crisis. It has to do with a lot of things. There's more room for criticism. There's less consistency. Other salient issues start to come up again, so people tend to see more and more divisions again. But it's already dying out. So that window of opportunity is basically almost closed. But that's for this very specific resource in people's willingness to accept specific policies. That's, I think, another window of opportunity than, for instance, the monetary response, which is a different thing.
So I'll pick up at the monetary response. So in the Netherlands, within 2 weeks, we are going to get our budget. So if you want some money to go to the arts and to the renewables, this is the moment for all of us to write massive letters to the parliamentarians about how we envisage a different world. So if the Fridays for Futures youth want a world without climate change, and if we want more culture, because that's important for the trust in society, then this is the moment. I mean, I'm being very specific in my answer to you, but immediately after that, in the Netherlands, our different parties will start to write their political agendas, their political documents, manifestos, and we have so much power as students and as staff. As staff, we are more able to write more scientific stuff. But as students, you can just simply send your letters in, and you will see it makes a difference, because all these people need to respond to their electorate. And perhaps you come from different countries. You come from Greece, or you come from Italy, or France, or UK. You can do the same thing, but you have to find these critical moments and do it. And I'll just give you one example. I used to be on this advisory panel that advised the cabinet on international issues for 8 years. It's a statutory body. And I was quite disappointed by the lack of response to my role in a statutory position. And then, of course, I stopped that job because my term was over. And in March, I wrote a letter to the Minister of Development Cooperation on rebuild with how do you deal with developing countries and Corona. And then I got a letter back. And I thought, this is very strange. And she wrote back to all development studies authors, scholars in the Netherlands. And suddenly I realized I had more power as a citizen. Of course, I had got lots of other people to sign the letter than I had when I had a statutory position. And I'm saying that you guys have the power. So if you want change, you have to just organize yourself, use your savvy online techniques, and use the right moments. Now for the Dutch budget, and in a few months for the Dutch manifestos of the different political parties. Do you want to add something?
I think I have a question. I think you also had a question, so I don't want to skip. Okay. I was just wondering, because you mentioned power now, if there is such thing as the responsibility of the academic during a pandemic, where does that lie exactly? What does that mean? Where, as academics, students and also as lecturers or researchers, what should we do in that respect?
So in our situation, what we were really afraid of, I mean, I don't know if you know about development cooperation, but the Netherlands government gives a percentage of the GDP as assistance to developing countries. And we know our GDP is going to go down because of this pandemic. That means we'll have less money for developing countries. And if a vaccine comes, and who's going to be able to afford it? So that was the reason why we thought we must quickly write this letter and send it off, because we want to make sure that the early money doesn't get spent inappropriately. Of course, we don't have the power. But what you notice is that as academics, it's not only important for us to do our work in terms of analyzing things in great detail and doing it the way you're doing it, with lots and lots of research behind it, or you're doing it, but also sometimes use your wisdom to come up with some quick and dirty issues and to raise those issues, even if it's not advice. And in my youth, I thought universities were the place where, the youth gathered and they protested about things. And somehow we've reached a point in the Western world that we sort of sit back and relax. And now I see the protests are coming back, the Fridays for Futures and others. And maybe that's the only way to get change. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. Well, regarding the roles that we have during the pandemic, I'm honestly struggling with that. On the one hand, I'm also a scholar that tries to work basically on the cross-section of society and policy on the one hand, and science on the other hand. I try to accommodate to both fields, and I really don't think there's this very big distinction. However, at the same time, I try to be quite careful where to use my title and where not. I'm an expert, for instance, on political trust, so I can be quite prolific in being very explicit about that in discussions and debates on political trust, but I won't use it for fields that I'm not an expert on. And over the last few months, particularly in the beginning of the lockdowns in various countries, you saw these huge debates being held by people using their academic title to get a standing in public debates, whereas at the same time they weren't experts on the stuff that they were talking about regarding, for instance, the lockdown or the lockdown policies. And that's one thing that I'm really struggling with, because as a private citizen, I've got a lot of ideas, a lot of comments on the lockdown, how it's being implemented in various countries, including the Netherlands. But as a scholar, not so much. And if I use my scholarly capital, if I should call it like that, in debates where I'm not an expert on, I don't think I can use it to the same extent later on when I am the expert. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I'm just trying to be open. This is, I think, a bit of an issue that I'm struggling with myself.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear. And I've also experienced this a little bit. I for some reason was added to the UVA list of experts on COVID, and now but this is because I've been working in preparedness and response of disasters and diseases before, and made some sense. But here I was, and then suddenly all the media calls came in, and they flooded in, and I was like, whoa, and am I that much of an expert? I don't know about all these things. I have no idea about economics or politics. You are much more, know much more about politics and about development, and we all have, we know a little bit of the complex reality. But what I did see after a while was in the beginning I was a little like, okay, well, I'll try to talk to the media and just give my view. What I start to see is that what is really important is some sort of nuance in the debate, because so much of the reporting seems to be, people seem to really think that they know what was right and that this is the way it is, and the difficulty and the complexity of things sometimes gets lost. And I felt like that the voices that we and also my colleagues were able to bring in the media were a bit more nuanced, like showing the nuance of things and showing the complexity of things. And I thought that was a role that I felt much more comfortable with. And I've also learned to now use the media more effectively. Like I send opinion pieces out to the newspapers, and they're more than happy to publish them too, because they like to hear from UvA professors or some other whatever you're affiliated with. But so in a way, I think it's useful to be part of that, and I'm very grateful that I can be. But I also I remain a little bit humble. What do we all know? But I do think we have a contribution to make there.
Thanks very much. We've got just a little less than half an hour left, and I'd really like to open it up to the floor now for your questions and comments. So if you have one, please raise your arm so I can see you, and I'll make sure you get the microphone. Yep, we'll start here. Do you want to do the microphone thing? There's also one in the live stream, but let's take this gentleman here first. Please make sure to speak into the mic, and maybe also tell us what your name is and what program you're with.
Which guy? I don't know. Hi, Eric. I'm doing the Masters in Sociology. I had a question for the research on the rally around the flag. We're seeing quite a big group now that actually doesn't believe in the crisis, and they're sort of denying the reality of Corona. Is that something new compared to the other cases that you talked about, and does it add another layer to your study?
There is a group that doesn't believe in the reality of this pandemic, or at the very least not so much in the measures, but that group is being enlarged artificially in media reports. So it gets a lot more attention than you would expect purely based on their size. And of course, all the logical trappings of social media and Twitter and general media that are looking for conflict, they factor in here. So their podium gets overblown. It's not a very large group. Even in terms of support for governmental policies, that support is even today quite overwhelming, although it is declining slowly. It does nevertheless still complicate the story, because I think fear is indeed a big driver of the rally around the flag, but it can also have the inverse effect. The inverse effect leading towards further cynicism towards politics, or cynicism towards the problem itself, the existence of the problem itself, or even the idea that it's all a big hoax. So I think that the role of fear is one that we should investigate further, and I think fear has this multifaceted effect. And that's also one of the reasons, I think, why fear in different circumstances in response to different crises doesn't always lead to the rally around the flag. I think the rally around the flag is being driven by fear, but not all fear in response to a crisis leads to the rally around the flag.
I think we've got a question from the live chat as well. You want to read that for us, Naomi?
So Luca also has a question for Tom. And he was asking, would you predict that if there were a second wave or third wave, there would be a repeated effect?
No, I think if there's a second wave, let alone a third wave, that at the very best, the effect will be a lot weaker. But I don't think the effect will be there, to be honest. In the past, when there were repeated external events, like terrorist attacks in Western countries, you saw, how awful this may sound, like diminishing effects on political trust. So the 9/11 had a huge effect in Western countries across the globe. The attacks in London and Madrid had much smaller effects, let alone those in France, for instance. When it comes to a second wave of COVID-19, that will probably be seen as the consequence of policies made by government itself. So suddenly then government is co-responsible for what's going on. It can be understood to be a failing of government itself. So unless there is a change of government with a new group of people stepping in that doesn't hold any form of responsibility, I don't think that a second wave will lead to a boost in trust. In fact, it might lead to the inverse. Just like with your Hurricane Katrina, because government wasn't prepared but could have been, government didn't respond in time when it could have. It had changed FEMA beforehand, the response organization in the United States, in a very perverse way, where it shouldn't have done that and didn't need to have done that. Therefore, it led there to a very strong decline in trust that George W. Bush suffered with for the rest of his term.
So basically the bottom line message to governments is be quick, be on time to be perceived as part of the solution and not part of the problem. Yeah. Other questions? There on the left.
Thank you. My name is Meer and I'm starting my master in urban studies. And I have a question about the research both on climate change and on fear in the political situation. Because you mentioned at the very end of your presentation that fear and its effect on the perceived legitimacy of our institutions can also be used in different ways and can also be a part of the whole climate change and how to deal with climate change debate. And my question is, in which ways can fear in that sense be used maybe as a political strategy to indeed increase this trust in our political legitimacy? Also, because I have the feeling that fear in this sense of COVID-19 and fear of climate change is a different layer, because fear of COVID-19 might be perceived as personal fear of my own well-being, whereas fear for the climate is more distant from us. So I was wondering, in your research, did you also dive into these different levels of fear and how they may tap into the perceived legitimacy? But also for you, have you researched the connection between fear and using fear in fighting climate change?
Excellent question. If I can go first, because I'm still holding the mic anyway. Basically, what you're proposing, the different types of fear and different the multidimensionality of fear, it's truly what we're planning to do in a third wave of this study. So we're trying to add what fear is and how it relates to different aspects of this crisis, lingering effects, acute effects, etc. So I like the way you're thinking, basically. But when it comes to climate change, I think politicians are already aware of never letting a good crisis go to waste. In fact, when politicians want to make big changes, they always start with an atmosphere of crisis. It's a quite common strategy. But when it comes to climate, it's not commonly used. And for instance, in the Netherlands, there was this external event a year ago, more than that even now, where suddenly judges stepped in, court stepped in and said, well, there are some demands, you have to change your climate policies. And government was then responding in a way that they were part of the problem, rather than saying, this is an external event, we're going to benefit from this. Thereby letting go of any form of boost in trust, boost in legitimacy that they could have gotten. My main fear is that either governments themselves will respond like that in the future when it comes to climate policies, or that the public, the broader public, will see government as co-responsible for the fact that no policies have yet been implemented to deal with climate change, and therefore there will not be this boost in support for any policies that they will come up with. And that's my main question, I guess, as well. How can we prevent that?
So I'll just give two answers to your question. The first is climate change is a super wicked, super unstructured problem, which means that those who cause the problem are not necessarily those who are going to be displaced. And so the bulk of the displacements, and most of the displacements take place in the global south right now from climate-related issues. So that's one of the reasons why, in the case of COVID-19, for example, I'm afraid I'll get sick. So if I can take some measures to protect myself, there's a direct, I might save myself, maybe I don't save him or anybody else. But in climate change, that relationship is not there. That's the first. And the second thing is the bigger fear in climate change with the politicians is that they're going to lose the money. That's why I brought the $300 trillion storyline, and it's the same for the Dutch government, because it's the Netherlands has made so much money from the fossil fuel industry, and we have so much knowledge that we continue, even today, to provide government subsidies for export credit to developing countries on fossil fuels. And that's much more than the money that we give them to help them adapt. And that's because we are propping up our own fossil fuel industries. So we are more afraid of the potential of losing money than we're afraid of the potential impacts. And that, I'm talking about the top, the people who are rich. I'm not talking about the students because they don't yet have a pension, and therefore their pensions are not yet involved in 6% in the fossil fuel industry. It's just the people over here. We are the ones who will lose our pensions if the fossil industry collapses. So there's the fear, the dimensions of fear are completely different. I don't research fear, so I'm scared because he's just told me I should be more nuanced. I can talk about any subject, but the dimensions of fear are different. Fear of loss of money more than anything else.
Thanks, I'll take this one. Naomi, there was another question. Yeah, in the dark red shirt.
Yes, hi, I'm Lucy. I'm part of the Medical Anthropology program. I have two questions. The first is really quick. Lazarus, I just wanted to ask if you could just name your blog, because I think if in case we don't get the slides, I don't know if you said the name, but I maybe missed it.
Yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's on WordPress, and it's Med Anthroblog.
Ah, okay.
It's really
easy to remember.
If you want, you can also talk to me after. I can send you an email or something.
Okay, sure thing.
Yep.
Okay, great. And the second question, I wanted to follow up on the issue of responsibility, because I have a medical background and I worked in global health for a bit, and I found it really distressing and fascinating how quickly COVID drowned out so many other issues. And for me, I feel like I'm starting to struggle a bit with this idea, trying to think about my master's thesis and everything, about how and where to contribute in a way that is helpful and which issues are relevant. And I for some reason, I feel like it's a tough issue to think about how something like medical anthropology can contribute and has to contribute, but then again, there's so many other issues that remain relevant, or maybe, I don't know, tuberculosis, malaria may become even more relevant due to COVID. So for me, I guess the question is, and that goes for the other disciplines as well, how can you struggle, or how can you find a good balance between contributing to solving the added issues that COVID now brings, but then not losing focus on so many other issues that, of course, all are touched by COVID, but have been there before, will be there after COVID, if there is an after COVID. So I think that's my question to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I would think that being persistent is very important, and there are questions out there that are not necessarily directly about COVID, and these are still huge issues, climate change. You may want to think about, obviously, that they're connected to COVID in the sense that everything right now is impacted by COVID. You just said it. So it's like a change in the context in which we conduct our work, the context of all the research, but there's still tens of thousands of other issues that are maybe not other, but at least they have their own reality, and they need to be studied. And definitely should not try to think it has to be about COVID or anything. COVID is going to be part of what you do anyway, because our entire society is upside down right now. Right, so what I would say is be persistent in where your passion is, and go for that, and don't let your path be sidetracked by COVID. It's like almost like a hype right now. COVID. That's going to disappear at some point again. The hype and the funding, and the issue of COVID is not going to disappear, I don't believe. But right now it seems to be all about COVID. That's going to change. So stick with your intuition, where your love and passion is, I would say.
Yeah, I can't agree more. My research is also nearly always stimulated by passion, and my passion, for some weird reason, is anger. So usually I read something or I hear something and I get really angry about that, and in response I'm going to do what I think is a better test or a better analysis and try to solve that problem. And I really think it's very important to keep close to your own passions, what you want to study, what you think is important to study. Having said that, to me, doing this research that I just mentioned is not a study that aims to solve anything to do with COVID-19. Rather, COVID-19 or the crisis is a leverage for me to understand the phenomena of this kind of thing, this type of crisis, the rally around the flag, and what it is and what it means for democracy as a whole. What angered me during the crisis, for instance, is the fact that parliaments across the globe basically went into social distancing, meaning, for some reason, that they would not control their own governments anymore to the same extent as before, even though we're in the middle of perhaps the biggest crisis since the Second World War. With all these implications, for some reason Parliament said, well, we trust governments, they are there, once every 2 weeks we're going to show up and check whether they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. I don't think that's correct. That's not democracy. That's what pissed me off, but I couldn't study that. But I could use the other element that I'm interested in, this crisis and political trust, and use COVID-19 as the leverage to understand what's going on a more structural basis. So you could look into whether or not the current situation has some unique facets that relates to your original passion.
And to add to that, I would separate two things in your mind as a student, a scholar. One is what you do research on, and one is the bigger picture that you have in your mind about how the world should function. And it is possible that the thing on which you do research on is a smaller part of that bigger issue. But I would also like to advise you to keep that bigger issue into account. And you see that with all my colleagues. Some of them are gender experts, and they want gender to be mainstreamed into every single topic that we work on. Others work on diversity, and they want diversity to be mainstreamed. And then now COVID and COVID to be mainstream. And I want climate to be mainstreamed. And he wants trust to be mainstreamed. And he would like culture to be mainstreamed. So, you know, we all want everything to be mainstreamed. And in some ways, what you want to separate two things out. The stuff on which you're doing research, a specific question, a specific method, a specific answer, and then your role as a conscious citizen, a conscious person who belongs to this globe and who's trying to make sure that we don't pass planetary boundaries and we don't end up in a complete mess because we can't control our systems, or that we redefine democracy because of some of the problems in democracy. You know, so to think of those bigger things and to keep them both slightly separate.
Yeah, I agree very much with both of you, and I think in a way, I'm just basically paraphrasing at this point, but it would be very interesting to find ways to use COVID and the pandemic as the foreground, where different dynamics just are, you know, they become very apparent that otherwise wouldn't be there. And I think because you also kind of asked how we can combine all these different fields, I think this is just a very good question, and I think the call for multidisciplinary approaches becomes very clear here, This is a prime example of how multiple disciplines can focus on the same issue and just contribute from different from different angles, I think.
Thank you, Laz. I think we've got another question from the live stream.
Yes. So Zofia is asking, I think it was during the time that Tom was still talking, could you say that due to the crisis, people are changing or rethinking their political views? And since you mentioned that there was a stronger boost in trust, particularly in the radical right.
Was that clear?
I don't think we should overestimate the extent to which people change their political roots and their political attitudes. In a way, we know that people are quite attached to their own values, and their voting behavior and their voting patterns relate to that. So from you might have voted radical right, and now you move towards the Conservative Party, which is not that big a step at the moment. And the Prime Minister's party is the Conservative Party. It's a rather small step to take. They don't shift all the way over to, for instance, the Greens or something like that. So in that sense, it's quite small. What I'm more interested in is what it does to this basic understanding of the attitudes towards the political body as a whole. People who are more cynical, that think politicians are inherently incompetent or inherently only care about themselves. There we see the biggest shift towards becoming more trusting. I think it's primarily a response to fear and seeing in this very specific circumstance that people care. And I think if we can learn anything from the past, from 9/11, or in the Netherlands, the murder on Pim Fortuyn, or the 2008 start of the Great Recession, is that people will go back to their original position later on. These attitudes are remarkably stable.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. Yeah, one or two more questions. Oh, yes.
Hi, I'm Miriam. I'm doing the Master's in Urban Studies, but my background is in political science. So my question is on political trust. Actually, I have two. You talk about rally around the flag, but I was wondering about cross-country differences between general levels of political trust. I'm from Sweden, and we had a very different response from most other countries. And I think in the international press, one of the explanations was, well, one of the explanations why all Swedes kind of went along with it was because the level of political trust is so high. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the determinants of that general level, and if you saw that play out during the pandemic in any way. And then my second question is concerning this, the fact that rally around the flag is a very short-run phenomenon, and the crises that we face are exactly the opposite. And if anything, it seems like what we need is stuff that survives electoral cycles. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how politicians can foster long-term trust. Yeah, thanks.
Great questions. Regarding the cross-national differences in trust, we know a lot of that. We can explain 85%, I think, of the cross-national differences in trust, particularly in established and developing democracies, I should add. And there we know a lot of the differences in political trust have to do with levels of corruption or impartiality of government. And that's one of the reasons why trust is so high in Sweden, quite high in the Netherlands, and not so high, for instance, in Southern Europe. So corruption matters a lot. And proportionality in your system, having proportional representation, for instance, also gives a boost. Over time, economic performance gives a boost, but it doesn't explain cross-national differences. But it's primarily impartiality and proportionality that really stimulate the trust. And when it comes to your second question, what can politicians do to hang on to trust or to ensure that there is this level of trust that continues over electoral cycles? That's by far the most important aspect. Impartiality, basically good governance, honest practices, and being open and transparent about those, on the one hand, and proportionality on the other. When one or two go down, let alone when both go down, you see that trust declines quite quickly. One of the reasons why trust is so problematic in the United States at the moment is that it's a very unproportional system. It's a winner-takes-all system in a lot of ways. It's very highly polarized in the sense that if you win the election, your supporters get a big boost in trust, but your opponents don't. There, the inverse happens. In fact, supporters for Trump, fun fact, were thinking that the economy was doing very badly and the United States were going down the drain until Trump got elected in the beginning of November. And 1 week after that, they had a big boost in the way the economy was going and the way that the country was going, etc., even though Trump was not yet in power. He wouldn't be for another 2 months. So in a polarized system, that's what happens, let alone when you combine that with corruption. Now, for your first question, do these cross-national differences in trust factor in? I think it's a little bit more complex than some of the political media describe. It's already a quite good description that indeed in countries that where the public has more trust, you see that the lockdown policies were more relaxed. And that makes sense because high trust leads to more law compliance. So if governments like Sweden or the Netherlands make suggestions, people are more likely to follow up on that. But it also has to do with bureaucratic traditions. There have been some great studies in public administration that for a very long time already showed that there are different traditions in different countries. And the Nordic countries are countries where there's a lot of joint collaboration with public organizations, with civil society organizations, whereas in countries like France or Spain or Italy, that's not so much the case. And you see the response to COVID-19 also relating back to those public administration differences, in the sense that France and Spain, and to a lesser extent Italy, were much more etatist, statist, in the sense that it was a top-down policy being implemented top-down with more coercion, whereas in some of the Nordic countries and the Netherlands, there was a different tradition. Similarly, by the way, in the United States and United Kingdom, where it's a more liberal tradition, again different from the other ones, but where also the policies were less stringent and less coercive.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much all for your excellent questions. I'd like to wrap it up with a question to the whole panel, bringing me back to the topic of disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. To my mind, it was very clear listening to you describe your research that this was very much a medical anthropology project, a political science project, an international development project, again, a medical anthropology project. Perhaps you could comment yourselves about what makes your projects so quintessentially of that discipline, but also to what extent you have drawn on or connected with other disciplines for so far as that's relevant.
Well, for our project, we had about 3 months to follow people over time. And some of people that we spoke with actually we had like 8 conversations with the same person, and at a certain point you really, build up trust, and you build up some relationship, and people felt that they were part of something, and that is in a way ethnographic to some extent, particularly, it's very anthropological to get to know somebody more in depth and spend more time with a person. At the same time, we were very constricted in that because we couldn't actually go, we couldn't see people in their own homes, we couldn't hang out with them. So it was also telephones and digital. I think that's also made us aware of the, like other ways of collecting data are just to complement it were very important to us. And so this is why we also work together with sociologists who conducted surveys. And we've seen that the triangulation, as you call it, the different kinds of data sources together pointing at the same thing makes for much stronger evidence. And that's what we were striving for. I'm not sure if we succeeded, but we tried. Oh, you have
Yeah. Political science is probably the most interdisciplinary of the social sciences. If you look at the way we cite different journals from different subfields, in most of the social sciences we tend to cite each other's works. Political science just ranks on top of that, by contrast to, for instance, economists who only cite other economists. Now, what I just presented here is almost prototypical political science in the sense that it deals with democratic legitimacy, a typical question that's central to political science. But in the research that I'm doing for this very specific article, you can see that I'm a political sociologist. I studied political science and history, then did my dissertation in sociology. And I cite work by historians, work by sociologists, work by psychologists on leadership, for instance, work by communication scholars on partisan cues. So in my theory, you can see that they all are integrated to come towards different approaches being out there in the scholarly field, working on explaining legitimacy in various ways. So in that sense, I still think it's interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary even though the object of this very specific study, democratic legitimacy itself, is quintessential political science.
I studied economics and law. Both of them are outside the social science faculty in some ways. In our group of international development studies, we've got anthropologists, we've got geographers, we've got an engineer, we've got economists, we've got sociologists. So we have people from different disciplines, because you cannot study development without looking at all these issues. And you can't study environment and development without looking at hydrology or climatology or something like that. You don't have to understand what they're saying, but you have to at least know what the issue is that you're trying to deal with. And so that basically means that in our group, so I'd go into a competition with you as to how interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary we are. But sometimes that creates a real big problem. So the uniting lens is the way we look at the world. So we look at the world through the lens of inclusive development and how do we govern it, and how do we especially focus on the poorest countries, the poorest people worldwide, and that includes also now increasingly in the global north. So we're also looking at, for example, the offshore islands of European countries that are neither south nor north. They're treated halfway. So we don't really just do one discipline. We can't. That's not possible anymore.
Yeah, I could try to fight both of you with anthropology, but at least for mass, I mean, it's in the name. It's medical anthropology and sociology. So I know most people treat it just as an anthropology master, but it's much more than that. By nature, for example, it's an interdisciplinary program. Now, this is my second master's. My first one was in clinical psychology at Leiden, and I have worked as a therapist and as a social psychologist. So also in my work, I was drawing, again, if we look at my citations, you'll see psychology, sociology, anthropology. I also used articles from urbanists and economists. So I think it's very difficult to create a clear hierarchy of you know, who has it best. I think, but exactly, and that I was about saying, that is the beauty, I think, of the social sciences and how mingled up everything is. In my work, that was mostly clear, firstly, due to the focus of my research that was in mental health practices. So my own psychological and clinical, especially psychological past was very apparent, and the inspiration I had of it. But at the same time, the fact that I chose to focus on the mundane aspects of these practices, so outside of clinical settings or institutional settings, for me that was there's a direct link with anthropology and sociology to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, amazing speakers, for the interesting information you've shared with us today. And I think it's been truly inspirational, and I hope it's been a pleasant taste for you of the year or 2 years to come at the Graduate School of Social Sciences. Again, welcome all of you here in the room and also out there on the web. And those in the room are really welcome to hang out with us for half an hour or an hour at the Crea Cafe now afterwards. But let's end with a big round of applause for our speakers.